History of Apple. Apple Incorporated is an American multinational technology company headquartered in Cupertino, California, that designs, develops, and sells consumer electronics, computer software, and online services. The company's hardware products include the iPhone smartphone, the iPad tablet computer, the Mac personal computer, the iPod portable media player, the Apple Watch smartwatch, the Apple TV digital media player, the AirPods wireless earbuds and the HomePod smart speaker. Apple's software includes the macOS, iOS, iPadOS, watchOS, and tvOS operating systems, the iTunes media player, the Safari web browser, the Shazam acoustic fingerprint utility, and the iLife and iWork creativity and productivity suites, as well as professional applications like Final Cut Pro, Logic Pro, and Xcode. Its online services include the iTunes Store, the iOS App Store, Mac App Store, Apple Music, Apple TV+, iMessage, and iCloud. Other services include Apple Store, Genius Bar, Apple Care, Apple Pay, Apple Pay Cash, and Apple Card. Apple was founded by Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Ronald Wayne in April 1976 to develop and sell Wozniak's Apple I personal computer, though Wayne sold his share back within 12 days. It was incorporated as Apple Computer Incorporated in January 1977, and sales of its computers, including the Apple II, grew quickly. Within a few years, Jobs and Wozniak had hired a staff of computer designers and had a production line. Apple went public in 1980 to instant financial success. Over the next few years, Apple shipped new computers featuring innovative graphical user interfaces, such as the original Macintosh in 1984, and Apple's marketing advertisements for its products received widespread critical acclaim. However, the high price of its products and limited application library caused problems, as did power struggles between executives. In 1985, Wozniak departed Apple amicably and remained an honorary employee, while Jobs and others resigned to found NeXT. For more than 3 decades, Apple Computer was predominantly a manufacturer of personal computers, including the Apple II, Macintosh, and Power Mac lines, but it faced rocky sales and low market share during the 1990s. Jobs, who had been ousted from the company in 1985, returned to Apple in 1996 after his company NeXT was bought by Apple. The following year he became the company's interim CEO, which later became permanent. Jobs subsequently instilled a new corporate philosophy of recognizable products and simple design, starting with the original iMac in 1998. With the introduction of the successful iPod music player in 2001 and iTunes Music Store in 2003, Apple established itself as a leader in the consumer electronics and media sales industries, leading it to drop computer from the company's name in 2007. The company is now also known for its iOS range of smartphone, media player, and tablet computer products that began with the iPhone, followed by the iPod Touch and then iPad. As of June 30, 2015, Apple was the largest publicly traded corporation in the world by market capitalization, with an estimated value of $1 trillion as of August 2, 2018. Apple's worldwide annual revenue in 2010 totaled $65 billion, growing to $127.8 billion in 2011 and $156 billion in 2012. 1975 to 1985, Jobs and Wozniak, pre-foundation. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak first met in mid-1971, when their mutual friend, Bill Fernandez, introduced then 21-year-old Wozniak to 16-year-old Jobs. Their first business partnership began later that year when Wozniak, a self-educated electronics engineer, started to build his original blue boxes that enabled one to make long-distance phone calls at no cost. Jobs managed to sell some 200 blue boxes for $150 each and split the profit with Wozniak. Jobs later told his biographer that if it hadn't been for Wozniak's blue boxes, there wouldn't have been an Apple. Jobs and Wozniak, also referred to collectively as the two Steves, had withdrawn from Red College and UC Berkeley respectively by 1975. Wozniak designed a video terminal that he could use to log on to the mini-computers at Call Computer. Alex Cameron commissioned the design and sold a small number of them through his firm. Aside from their interest in up-to-date technology, the impetus for the two Steves seems to have had another source. In his essay From Satori to Silicon Valley, published 1986, cultural historian Theodore Roshak made the point that the Apple computer emerged from within the West Coast counterculture and the need to produce printouts, letter labels, and databases. Roshak offers a bit of background on the development of the two Steves prototype models. In 1975, the two Steves started attending meetings of the Homebrew Computer Club. New microcomputers such as the Altair 8800 and the IMSI inspired Wozniak to build a microprocessor into his video terminal and have a complete computer. At the time, the only microcomputer CPUs generally available were the $179 Intel 8080, equivalent to $850 in 2019, and the $170 Motorola 6800, equivalent to $808 in 2019. Wozniak preferred the 6800, but both were out of his price range. So he watched, and learned, and designed computers on paper, waiting for the day he could afford a CPU. When MOS Technology released its $20, equivalent to $90 in 2019, 6502 chip in 1976, Wozniak wrote a version of BASIC for it, then began to design a computer for it to run on. The 6502 was designed by the same people who designed the 6800, as many in Silicon Valley left employers to form their own companies. Wozniak's earlier 6800 paper computer needed only minor changes to run on the new chip. By March 1, 1976, Wozniak completed the machine and took it to a Homebrew Computer Club meeting to show it off. When Jobs saw Wozniak's computer, which would later become known as the Apple I, he was immediately interested in its commercial potential. Initially, Wozniak intended to share schematics of the machine for free, but Jobs insisted that they should instead build and sell bare printed circuit boards for the computer. Wozniak also originally offered the design to Hewlett-Packard, HP, where he worked at the time but was denied by the company on 5 different occasions. Jobs eventually convinced Wozniak to go into business together and start a new company of their own. In order to raise the money they needed to produce the first batch of printed circuit boards, Jobs sold his Volkswagen Type 2 minibus for a few $100s, and Wozniak sold his HP 65 programmable calculator for $500. Apple I and Company formation. On April 1, 1976, Apple Computer Company was founded by Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Ronald Wayne. The company was registered as a California business partnership. Wayne, who worked at Atari as a chief draftsman, agreed to become a co-founder of the company in return for a 10% stake. However, Wayne was somewhat gun-shy due to the failure of his own venture 4 years earlier. On April 12, less than 2 weeks after the company's formation, Wayne left Apple, selling his 10% share back to the two Steves for only $800 and leaving them as the active primary co-founders. According to Wozniak, Jobs proposed the name Apple Computer when he had just come back from Robert Friedland's All-One Farm in Oregon. Jobs told Walter Isaacson that he was on one of my fruitarian diets when he conceived of the name and thought it sounded fun, spirited and not intimidating. Plus, it would get us ahead of Atari in the phone book. Soon after the company was formed, the two Steves made one last trip to the Homebrew Computer Club and demonstrated the finished version of the Apple I. Paul Terrell, who operated a computer store chain named the Byte Shop, was in attendance and became impressed with the machine. He handed the two Steves his card, and told them to keep in touch. The following day, Jobs dropped in on Terrell at the Byte Shop store in Mountain View and tried to sell him the bare circuit boards for the Apple I. Terrell told Jobs that he was interested in purchasing the machine, but only if it came fully assembled, saying he would order 50 assembled computers and pay $500 each on delivery, equivalent to $2,200 in 2019. Jobs then took the purchase order that he had been given from the Byte Shop to Kramer Electronics, a national electronic parts distributor, and ordered the components he needed to assemble the Apple I. The local credit manager asked Jobs how he was going to pay for the parts, and he replied, "I have this purchase order from the Byte Shop chain of computer stores for 50 of my computers and the payment terms are COD. If you give me the parts on a net 30-day term, I can build and deliver the computers in that time frame, collect my money from Terrell at the Byte Shop and pay you." The credit manager called Paul Terrell, who was attending an IEEE computer conference at a Salomon in Pacific Grove, and verified the validity of the purchase order. Amazed at the tenacity of Jobs, Terrell assured the credit manager if the computers showed up in his stores, Jobs would be paid and would have more than enough money to pay for the parts order. The two Steves and their small crew spent day and night building and testing the computers, and delivered to Terrell on time to pay his suppliers. Terrell was surprised when Jobs delivered him a batch of assembled circuit boards, as he had expected complete computers with a case, monitor and keyboard. Nonetheless, Terrell kept his word and paid the two Steves the money he had promised them. The Apple I went on sale in July 1976 as an assembled circuit board with a retail price of $666.66. Wozniak later said he had no idea about the relation between the number and the mark of the beast, and that he came up with the price because he liked repeating digits. Eventually, about 200 units of the Apple I were sold. The Apple I computer had a few notable features. One was the use of a TV as the display system, whereas many machines had no display at all. This was not like the displays of later machines. However, the text was displayed at 60 characters per second. However, this was still faster than the teleprinters used on contemporary machines of that era. The Apple I also included bootstrap code on ROM, which made it easier to start up. Finally, at the insistence of Paul Terrell, Wozniak also designed a cassette interface for loading and saving programs, at the then rapid pace of 1,200 bits per second. Although the machine was fairly simple, it was nevertheless a masterpiece of design, using far fewer parts than anything in its class, and quickly earning Wozniak a reputation as a master designer. Encouraged by the success of the Apple I, Jobs started looking for investment to further expand the business, but banks were reluctant to lend him money. The idea of a computer for ordinary people seemed absurd at the time. In August 1976, Jobs approached his former boss at Atari, Nolan Bushnell, who recommended that he meet with Don Valentine, the founder of Sequoia Capital. Valentine was not interested in funding Apple, but in turn introduced Jobs to Mike Markkula, a millionaire who had worked under him at Fairchild Semiconductor. Markkula, unlike Valentine, saw a great potential in the two Steves, and decided to become an angel investor of their company. He invested $92,000 in Apple out of his own property while securing a $250,000, equivalent to $1,120,000 in 2019, line of credit from Bank of America. In return for his investment, Markkula received a 1/3 stake in Apple. With the help of Markkula, Apple Computer Incorporated was incorporated on January 3, 1977. The new corporation bought out the old partnership the two Steves formed 9 months earlier. In February 1977, Markkula recruited Michael Scott from National Semiconductor to serve as the first president and CEO of Apple Computer, as Jobs and Wozniak were both insufficiently experienced and he was not interested in taking that position himself. That same month, Wozniak resigned from his job at Hewlett-Packard to work full-time for Apple. Apple II. Almost as soon as Apple had started selling its first computers, Wozniak moved on from the Apple I and began designing a greatly improved computer, the Apple II. Wozniak completed a working prototype of the new machine by August 1976. The two Steves presented the Apple II computer to the public at the first West Coast Computer Fair on April 16 and 17, 1977. On the first day of the exhibition, Jobs introduced the Apple II to a Japanese chemist named Toshio Mizushima, who became the first authorized Apple dealer in Japan. In the May 1977 issue of Byte, Wozniak said of the Apple II design, "To me, a personal computer should be small, reliable, convenient to use, and inexpensive." The Apple II went on sale on June 10, 1977, with a retail price of $1,298. The computer's main internal difference from its predecessor was a completely redesigned TV interface, which held the display and memory. Now not only useful for simple text display, the Apple II included graphics and, eventually, color. During the development of the Apple II, Jobs pressed for a well-designed plastic case and built-in keyboard, with the idea that the machine should be fully packaged and ready to run out of the box. This was almost the case for the Apple I computers, but one still needed to plug various parts together and type in the code to run BASIC. Jobs wanted the Apple II case to be simple and elegant, and hired an industrial designer named Jerry Minnock to produce such a case design. Apple employee number 5 Rod Holt developed the switching power supply. While early Apple II models used ordinary cassette tapes as storage devices, they were superseded in 1978 by the introduction of a 5 1/4-inch floppy disk drive and interface called the Disk II. The Disk II system was designed by Wozniak and released with a retail price of $495. In 1979, the Apple II was chosen to be the desktop platform for the first killer application of the business world, VisiCalc, a spreadsheet program. VisiCalc created a business market for the Apple II and gave home users an additional reason to buy an Apple II, compatibility with the Office. Before VisiCalc, Apple had been a distant third-place competitor to Commodore and Tandy. The Apple II was one of the 3 1977 Trinity computers generally credited with creating the home computer market, the other two being the Commodore PET and the Tandy Corporation TRS-80. A number of different models of the Apple II were built thereafter, including the Apple II and Apple X, which continued in public use for nearly 2 decades. The Apple II series went on to sell about 6 million units in total before it was discontinued in 1993. Apple III. While the Apple II was already established as a successful business-ready platform because of VisiCalc, Apple management was not content. The Apple III was designed to take on the business environment in an attempt to compete with IBM in the business and corporate computing market. While development of the Apple III started in late 1978 under the guidance of Wendell Sander, the machine was subsequently developed by a committee headed by Steve Jobs. The Apple III was first announced on May 19, 1980, with a retail price ranging from $4,340 to $7,800, and released in November 1980. The Apple III was a relatively conservative design for computers of the era. However, Jobs did not want the computer to have a fan, rather, he wanted the heat generated by the electronics to be dissipated through the chassis of the machine, foregoing the cooling fan. However, the physical design of the case was not sufficient to cool the components inside it. By removing the fan from the design, the Apple III was prone to overheating. This caused the integrated circuit chips to disconnect from the motherboard. Customers who contacted Apple customer service were told to raise the computer 6 inches in the air, and then let go, which would cause the X to fall back into place. Thousands of Apple III computers were recalled. A new model was introduced in 1983 to try to rectify the problems, but the damage was already done. Apple IPO. In the July 1980 issue of Kilobaud Microcomputing, publisher Wayne Green stated that the best consumer ads I've seen have been those by Apple. They are attention-getting, and they must be prompting sale. In August, the Financial Times reported that Apple Computer, the fast-growing Californian manufacturer of small computers for the consumer, business and educational markets, is planning to go public later this year. It is the largest private manufacturer in the U.S. of small computers. Founded about 5 years ago as a small workshop business, it has become the second-largest manufacturer of small computers, after the Radio Shack division of the Tandy Company. On December 12, 1980, Apple, ticker symbol Apple, went public selling 4.6 million shares at $22 per share, $39 per share when adjusting for stock splits as of March 30, 2019, generating over $100 million. Which was more capital than any IPO since Ford Motor Company in 1956. Several venture capitalists cashed out, reaping billions in long-term capital gains. By the end of the day, the stock rose to $29 per share and 300 millionaires were created. Apple's market cap was $1.778 billion at the end of its first day of trading. In January 1981, Apple held its first shareholders' meeting as a public company in the Flint Center, a large auditorium at nearby De Anza College, which is often used for symphony concerts, to handle the larger numbers of shareholders post-IPO. The business of the meeting had been planned so that the voting could be staged in 15 minutes or less. In most cases, voting proxies are collected by mail and counted days or months before a meeting. In this case, after the IPO, many shares were in new hands. Steve Jobs started his prepared speech, but after being interrupted by voting several times, he dropped his prepared speech and delivered a long, emotionally charged talk about betrayal, lack of respect, and related topics. Competition from the IBM PC. By August 1981, Apple was among the three largest microcomputer companies, perhaps having replaced Radio Shack as the leader. Revenue in the first half of the year had already exceeded 1980's $118 million, and InfoWorld reported that lack of production capacity was constraining growth. IBM entered the personal computer market that month with the IBM PC, but Apple had many advantages. While IBM began with one microcomputer, little available hardware or software, and a couple of hundred dealers, Apple had 5 times as many dealers in the US and an established international distribution network. The Apple II had an installed base of more than 250,000 customers, and hundreds of independent developers offered software and peripherals. At least 10 databases and 10 word processors were available, while the PC had no databases and one word processor. Because of VisiCalc, businesses purchased 90% of Apple is. The company's customers gained a reputation for devotion and loyalty. Biden 1984 stated that there are 2 kinds of people in the world, people who say Apple isn't just a company, it's a cause, and people who say Apple isn't a cause, it's just a company. Both groups are right. Nature has suspended the principle of non-contradiction where Apple is concerned. Apple is more than just a company because its founding has some of the qualities of myth. Apple is 2 guys in a garage undertaking the mission of bringing computing power, once reserved for big corporations, to ordinary individuals with ordinary budgets. The company's growth from 2 guys to a billion-dollar corporation exemplifies the American dream. Even as a large corporation, Apple plays David to IBM's Goliath, and thus has the sympathetic role in that myth. The magazine noted, however, that the loyalty was not entirely positive for Apple. Customers were willing to overlook real flaws in its products, even while comparing the company to a higher standard than for competitors. The Apple III was an example of the company's reputation among dealers that one described as Apple arrogance. After examining a PC and finding it unimpressive, Apple confidently purchased a full-page advertisement in the Wall Street Journal with the headline "Welcome, IBM." Seriously. Microsoft head Bill Gates was at Apple headquarters the day of IBM's announcement and later said they didn't seem to care. It took them a full year to realize what had happened. Apple prioritized the Apple III for 3 years, spending what Steve Wozniak estimated as $100 million on marketing and R&D and avoiding improving the Apple II to compete with the PC, as doing so could hurt III sales. By 1983 the PC surpassed the Apple II as the best-selling personal computer, and Gene Amdahl predicted that Apple would be another of the many brash young companies that IBM had defeated. By 1984 IBM had $4 billion in annual PC revenue, more than twice that of Apple and as much as the sales of it and the next 3 companies combined. A Fortune survey found that 56% of American companies with personal computers used IBM PCs, compared to 16% for Apple. Small businesses, schools, and some homes became the second's primary market. Xerox PARC and the Lisa. Apple Computer's business division was focused on the Apple III, another iteration of the text-based computer. Simultaneously the Lisa Group worked on a new machine that would feature a completely different interface and introduce the words mouse, icon, and desktop into the lexicon of the computing public. In return for the right to buy $1 million of pre-IPO stock, Xerox granted Apple Computer 3 days access to the Park facilities. After visiting Park, they came away with new ideas that would complete the foundation for Apple Computer's first GUI computer, the Apple Lisa. The first iteration of Apple's WIMP interface was a floppy disk where files could be spatially moved around. After months of usability testing, Apple designed a Lisa interface of windows and icons. The Lisa was introduced in 1983 at a cost of $9,995, equivalent to $25,700 in 2019. Because of the high price, Lisa failed to penetrate the business market. Macintosh in the 1984 commercial. By 1984, computer dealers saw Apple as the only clear alternative to IBM's influence. The company announced the Macintosh 128K to the press in October 1983, followed by an 18-page brochure included with magazines in December. Its debut, however, was announced by a single national broadcast of a $1.5 million television commercial, 1984. Equivalent to $3,700,000 in 2019. It was directed by Ridley Scott, aired during the third quarter of Super Bowl XVIII on January 22, 1984, and is now considered a watershed event and a masterpiece. 1984 used an unnamed heroine to represent the coming of the Macintosh, indicated by her white tank top with a Picasso-style picture of Apple's Macintosh computer on it. As a means of saving humanity from conformity, Big Brother. These images were an allusion to George Orwell's noted novel, 1984, which described a dystopian future ruled by a televised Big Brother. The commercial ended with the words, "On January 24, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984." On January 24, 1984, the Macintosh went on sale with a retail price of $2,495. It came bundled with two applications designed to show off its interface, MacWrite and MacPaint. On the same day, an emotional Jobs introduced the computer to a wildly enthusiastic audience at Apple's annual shareholders meeting held in the Flint Auditorium. Macintosh engineer Andy Hertzfeld described the scene as pandemonium. Jobs had directed the development of the Macintosh since 1981 when he took over the project from early Apple employee Jeff Raskin, who conceived the computer. Wozniak, who had crucial influence over the initial design and development of the program with Raskin, was on leave during this time due to an airplane crash earlier that year. The Macintosh was based on the Lisa, and Xerox PARC's mouse-driven graphical user interface, and it was widely acclaimed by the media with strong initial sales supporting it. However, the computer's slow processing speed and limited range of available software led to a rapid sales decline in the second half of 1984. The Macintosh was too radical for some, who labeled it a mere toy. Because the machine was entirely designed around the GUI, existing text mode and command-driven applications had to be redesigned and the programming code rewritten. This was a challenging undertaking that many software developers shied away from, and resulted in an initial lack of software for the new system. In April 1984, Microsoft's Multiplan migrated over from MS-DOS, followed by Microsoft Word in January 1985. In 1985, Lotus Software introduced Lotus Jazz after the success of Lotus 1-2-3 for the IBM PC, although it was largely a flop. Apple introduced Macintosh Office the same year with the Lemmings ad, infamous for insulting potential customers. It was not successful. For a special post-election edition of Newsweek in November 1984, Apple spent more than $2.5 million to buy all 39 of the advertising pages in the issue. Apple also ran a test drive a Macintosh promotion, in which potential buyers with a credit card could take home a Macintosh for 24 hours and return it to a dealer afterward. While 200,000 people participated, dealers disliked the promotion. The supply of computers was insufficient for demand, and many were returned in such a bad shape that they could no longer be sold. This marketing campaign caused CEO John Sculley to raise the price from $1,995 equivalent to $4,900 in 2019, to $2,495, equivalent to $6,100 in 2019. The Macintosh also spawned the concept of Mac evangelism, which was pioneered by Apple employee, and later Apple fellow, Guy Kawasaki. 1985, Jobs and Wozniak leave Apple. By early 1985, the Macintosh's failure to defeat the IBM PC became clear. This triggered a power struggle between Steve Jobs and CEO John Sculley, who had been hired 2 years earlier by Jobs using the famous line, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life or come with me and change the world?" Sculley and Jobs' visions for the company greatly differed. The former favored open architecture computers like the Apple II, sold to education, small business, and home markets less vulnerable to IBM. Jobs wanted the company to focus on the closed architecture Macintosh as a business alternative to the IBM PC. President and CEO Sculley had little control over chairman of the board Jobs' Macintosh division. It and the Apple II division operated like separate companies, duplicating services. Although its products provided 85% of Apple's sales in early 1985, the company's January 1985 annual meeting did not mention the Apple II division or employees. This frustrated Wozniak, who left active employment at Apple early that same year to pursue other ventures, stating that the company had been going in the wrong direction for the last 5 years and sold most of his stock. Despite these grievances, Wozniak left the company amicably and as of January 2018 continues to represent Apple at events or in interviews, receiving a stipend over the years for this role estimated in 2006 to be $120,000 per year. In April 1985, Sculley decided to remove Jobs as the general manager of the Macintosh division, and gained unanimous support from the Apple board of directors. Rather than submit to Sculley's direction, Jobs attempted to oust him from his leadership role at Apple. Informed by Jean-Louis Gassi, Sculley found out that Jobs had been attempting to organize a coup and called an emergency executive meeting at which Apple's executive staff sided with Sculley and stripped Jobs of all operational duties. Jobs, while taking the position of chairman of the firm, had no influence over Apple's direction and subsequently resigned from Apple in September 1985 and took a number of capable Apple employees with him to found NeXT Incorporated in a show of defiance at being set aside by Apple Computer. Jobs sold all but one of his 6.5 million shares in the company for $70 million. Jobs then acquired the visual effects house, Pixar for $5 million. Equivalent to $11,700,000 in 2019. NeXT Incorporated would build computers with futuristic designs and the Unix-derived NextStep operating system. NextStep would eventually be developed into macOS X. While not a commercial success, due in part to its high price, the NeXT computer would introduce important concepts to the history of the personal computer, including serving as the initial platform for Tim Berners-Lee as he was developing the World Wide Web. Sculley reorganized the company, unifying sales and marketing in one division and product operations and development in another. Despite initial marketing difficulties, the Macintosh brand was eventually a success for Apple. This was due to its introduction of desktop publishing, and later computer animation, through Apple's partnership with Adobe Systems, which introduced the laser printer and Adobe PageMaker. Indeed, the Macintosh would become known as the de facto platform for many industries including cinema, music, advertising, publishing, and the arts. 1985 to 1997, Sculley, Spindler, Emilio. Corporate performance. Under leadership of John Sculley, Apple issued its first corporate stock dividend on May 11, 1987. A month later on June 16, Apple stock split for the first time in a 2-to-1 split. Apple kept a quarterly dividend with about 0.3% yield until November 21, 1995. Between March 1988 and January 1989, Apple undertook 5 acquisitions, including software companies Network Innovations, Styleware, Nashiba Systems, and Coral Software, as well as satellite communications company Orion Network Systems. Apple continued to sell both lines of its computers, the Apple II and the Macintosh. A few months after introducing the Mac, Apple released a compact version of the Apple II called the Apple IC. And in 1986 Apple introduced the Apple X, an Apple II positioned as something of a hybrid product with a mouse-driven, Mac-like operating environment. Even with the release of the first Macintosh, Apple II computers remained the main source of income for Apple for years. The Mac family. At the same time, the Mac was becoming a product family of its own. The original model evolved into the Mac Plus in 1986 and spawned the Mac SE and the Mac II in 1987 and the Mac Classic and Mac LC in 1990. Meanwhile, Apple attempted its first portable Macs, the failed Macintosh Portable in 1989 and then the more popular PowerBook in 1991, a landmark product that established the modern form and ergonomic layout of the laptop. Popular products and increasing revenues made this a good time for Apple. MacAddict magazine has called 1989 to 1991 the first golden age of the Macintosh. On February 19, 1987, Apple registered the apple.com domain name, making it one of the first 100 companies to register a .com address on the nascent Internet. Early mid-1990s. In the late 1980s, Apple's fiercest technological rivals were the Amiga and Atari ST platforms. But computers based on the IBM PC were far more popular than all three, and by the 1990s, they finally had a comparable GUI thanks to Windows 3.0, and were out-competing Apple. Apple's response to the PC threat was a profusion of new Macintosh lines such as Quadra, Centris, and Performa. However, these new lines were marketed poorly by what was now arguably one of the worst-managed companies in the industry. For one, there were too many models, differentiated by very minor graduations in their tech specs. The excess of arbitrary model numbers confused many consumers and hurt Apple's reputation for simplicity. Apple's retail resellers like Sears and CompUSA often failed to sell or even competently display these Macs. Compounding matters was the fact that, although the machines were cheaper than a comparable PC, when taken into account all of the components built in that had to be added to the bare-bones PC, the poor marketing gave the impression that the machines were more expensive. Inventory grew as Apple consistently underestimated demand for popular models and overestimated demand for others. In 1991, Apple partnered with longtime competitor IBM and Motorola to form the AIM Alliance. The ultimate goal was to create a revolutionary new computing platform, known as PrEP, which would use IBM and Motorola hardware and Apple software. As the first step toward the PrEP platform, Apple started the Power Macintosh line in 1994, using PowerPC processors from Motorola and IBM. These processors used a RISC architecture, which differed substantially from the Motorola 680x0 series that were used by all previous Macs. Parts of Apple's operating system software were rewritten so that most software written for older Macs could run in emulation on the PowerPC series. Apple also refused IBM's offer to purchase the company, but later unsuccessfully sought another offer from IBM, and at one point was hours away from an acquisition by Sun Microsystems. In addition to computers, Apple has also produced consumer devices. In 1993, Apple released the Newton, an early personal digital assistant, PDA. It defined and launched the PDA category and was a forerunner and inspiration of devices such as Palm Pilot and Pocket PC. In 1994 Apple launched eWorld, an online service providing email, news and a bulletin board system to replace Apple Link. It was shut down in 1996. During 1995, a decision was made to, officially, start licensing the macOS and Macintosh ROMs to third-party manufacturers who started producing Macintosh clones. This was done in order to achieve deeper market penetration and extra revenue for the company. This decision led to Apple having over a 10% market share until 1997 when Steve Jobs was rehired as interim CEO to replace Gil Amelio. Jobs promptly found a loophole in the licensing contracts Apple had with the clone manufacturers and terminated the Macintosh OS licensing program, ending the Macintosh clone era. The result of this action was that Macintosh computer market share quickly fell from 10% to around 3%. In 1996, the struggling NeXT company beat out Incorporated's tvOS in its bid to sell its operating system to Apple. Apple purchased Steve Jobs' company, NeXT, on December 10, 1996, and its next step operating system. This would not only bring Steve Jobs back to Apple's management, but NeXT technology would become the foundation of the macOS X operating system. 1997 to 2001, Apple's comeback. Return of Steve Jobs. On July 9, 1997, Gil Amelio was ousted as CEO of Apple by the board of directors. Jobs stepped in as the interim CEO to begin a critical restructuring of the company's product line. He would eventually become CEO and served in that position until August 2011. On August 24, 2011, Steve Jobs resigned his position as Chief Executive Officer of Apple before his long battle with pancreatic cancer took his life on October 5, 2011. On November 10, 1997, Apple introduced the Apple Store, an online retail store based upon the WebObjects application server the company had acquired in its purchase of NeXT. The new direct sales outlet was also tied to a new build-to-order manufacturing strategy. Microsoft deal. At the 1997 Macworld Expo, Steve Jobs announced that Apple would be entering into a partnership with Microsoft. Included in this was a 5-year commitment from Microsoft to release Microsoft Office for Macintosh, as well as a $150 million investment in Apple. As part of the deal, Apple and Microsoft agreed to settle a long-standing dispute over whether Microsoft's Windows operating system infringed on any of Apple's patents. It was also announced that Internet Explorer would be shipped as the default browser on the Macintosh, with the user being able to have a preference. Microsoft Chairman Bill Gates appeared at the expo on screen, further explaining Microsoft's plans for the software they were developing for Mac, and stating that he was very excited to be helping Apple return to success. After this, Steve Jobs said this to the audience at the expo. "If we want to move forward and see Apple healthy and prospering again, we have to let go of a few things here. We have to let go of this notion that for Apple to win, Microsoft has to lose. We have to embrace a notion that for Apple to win, Apple has to do a really good job. And if others are going to help us, that's great, because we need all the help we can get, and if we screw up and we don't do a good job, it's not somebody else's fault, it's our fault." So I think that is a very important perspective. If we want Microsoft Office on the Mac, we better treat the company that puts it out with a little bit of gratitude. We'd like their software. So, the era of setting this up as a competition between Apple and Microsoft is over as far as I'm concerned. This is about getting Apple healthy. This is about Apple being able to make incredibly great contributions to the industry and to get healthy and prosper again. The day before the announcement, Apple had a market cap of $2.46 billion and had ended its previous quarter with quarterly revenues of $1.7 billion and cash reserves of $1.2 billion, making the $150 million amount of the investment largely symbolic. Apple CFO Fred Anderson stated that Apple would use the additional funds to invest in its core markets of education and creative content. iMac, iBook, and Power Mac G4. While discontinuing Apple's licensing of its operating system to third-party computer manufacturers, one of Jobs' first moves as new acting CEO was to develop the iMac, which bought Apple time to restructure. The original iMac integrated a CRT display and CPU into a streamlined, translucent plastic body. The line became a sales smash, moving about 1 million units each year. It also helped reintroduce Apple to the media and public, and announced the company's new emphasis on the design and aesthetics of its products. In 1999, Apple introduced the Power Mac G4, which utilized the Motorola-made Power PC 7400 containing a 128-bit instruction unit known as AltiVec, its flagship processor line. Also that year, Apple unveiled the iBook, its first consumer-oriented laptop that was also the first Macintosh to support the use of wireless LAN via the optional airport card that was based on the 802.11b standard. It helped popularize the use of wireless LAN technology to connect computers to networks. macOS X. In 2001, Apple introduced macOS X, now known as macOS, an operating system based on the XT's NeST and incorporating parts of the FreeBSD kernel. Aimed at consumers and professionals alike, macOS X married the stability, reliability, and security of Unix with the ease of a completely overhauled user interface. To aid users in transitioning their applications from macOS 9, the new operating system allowed the use of macOS 9 applications through the classic environment. Apple's Carbon API also allowed developers to adapt their macOS 9 software to use macOS X's features. Retail stores. In May 2001, after much speculation, Apple announced the opening of a line of Apple retail stores, to be located throughout the major U.S. computer buying markets. The stores were designed for two primary purposes: to stem the tide of Apple's declining share of the computer market and to respond to poor marketing of Apple products at third-party retail outlets. 2001 to 2007, iPods, iTunes Store, Intel transition. iPod. In October 2001, Apple introduced its first iPod portable digital audio player. Then iPod started as a 5 GB player capable of storing around 1,000 songs. Since then it has evolved into an array of products including the Mini, now discontinued, the iPod Touch, the Shuffle, now discontinued, the iPod Classic, also discontinued, the Nano, now discontinued, the iPhone and the iPad. Since March 2011, the largest storage capacity for an iPod has been 160 GB. Speaking to software developers on June 6, 2005, Steve Jobs said the company's share of the entire portable music device market stood at 76%. The iPod gave an enormous lift to Apple's financial results. In the quarter ending March 26, 2005, Apple earned $290 million, or 34 cents a share, on sales of $3.24 billion. The year before in the same quarter, Apple earned just $46 million, or 6 cents a share, on revenue of $1.91 billion. Moving on from colored plastics and the PowerPC G3. In early 2002, Apple unveiled a completely redesigned iMac, using the G4 processor and LCD display. The new Imac G4 design had a white hemispherical base and a flat panel all-digital display supported by a swiveling chrome neck. After several iterations increasing the processing speed and screen sizes from 15 inches to 17 inches to 20 inches, the iMac G4 was discontinued and replaced by the iMac G5 in the summer of 2004. In 2002, Apple also released the Zerv 1U rack-mounted server. Originally featuring two G4 chips, the Zerv was unusual for Apple in two ways. It represented an earnest effort to enter the enterprise computer market, and it was also relatively cheaper than similar machines released by its competitors. This was due, in no small part, to Apple's use of fast-dotted drives as opposed to the SCSI hard drives used in traditional rack-mounted servers. Apple later released the Zerv RAID, a 14-drive RAID that was, again, cheaper than competing systems. In mid-2003, Steve Jobs launched the Power Mac G5, based on IBM's G5 processor. Its all-metal anodized aluminum chassis finished Apple's transition away from colored plastics in their computers. Apple claims this was the first 64-bit computer sold to the general public. The Power Mac G5 was also used by Virginia Tech to build its prototype System X supercomputing cluster, which at the time garnered the prestigious recognition of the third fastest supercomputer in the world. It cost only $5.2 million to build, far less than the previous number 3 and other ranking supercomputers. Apple's Zervs were soon updated to use the G5 as well. They replaced the Power Mac G5 machines as the main building block of Virginia Tech's System X, which was ranked in November 2004 as the world's 7th fastest supercomputer. A new iMac based on the G5 processor was unveiled August 31, 2004 and was made available in mid-September. This model dispensed with the base altogether, placing the CPU and the rest of the computing hardware behind the flat panel screen, which is suspended from a streamlined aluminum foot. This new iMac, dubbed the Imac G5, was the world's thinnest desktop computer, measuring in at around 2 inches, around 5 centimeters. 2004, however, was a turning point for Apple. After creating a sizable financial base to work with, the company began experimenting with new parts from new suppliers. As a result, Apple was able to produce new designs quickly over a short amount of time, with the release of the iPod Video, then the iPod Classic, and eventually the iPod Touch and iPhone. On April 29, 2005, Apple released macOS X v10.4 Tiger to the general public. Apple's wildly successful PowerBook and iBook products relied on Apple's previous generation G4 architecture, which were produced by Freescale Semiconductor, a spin-off from Motorola. Engineers at IBM had minimal success in making their PowerPC G5 processor consume less power and run cooler, but not enough to run in iBook or PowerBook formats. As of the week of October 24, 2005, Apple released the Power Mac G5 Dual that features a dual-core processor. This processor contains 2 cores in one rather than have 2 separate processors. Apple has also developed the Power Mac G5 Quad that uses 2 of the dual-core processors for enhanced workstation power and performance. The new Power Mac G5 dual cores run individually at 2.0 GHz or 2.3 GHz. The Power Mac G5 Quad cores run individually at 2.5 GHz, and all variations have a graphics processor that has 256-bit memory bandwidth. Retail store expansion. Initially, the Apple stores were only opened in the United States, but in late 2003, Apple opened its first Apple store abroad, in Tokyo's Ginza district. Ginza was followed by a store in Osaka, Japan in August 2004. In 2005, Apple opened stores in Nagoya, the Shibuya district of Tokyo, Fukuoka, and Sendai. Another store was opened in Sapporo in 2006. Apple's first European store opened in London, on Regent Street, in November 2004. A store in the Bullring Shopping Centre in Birmingham opened in April 2005, and the Blue Water Shopping Centre in Dartford, Kent opened in July 2005. Apple opened its first store in Canada in the middle of 2005 at the Yorkdale Shopping Centre in North York, Toronto. Later on in 2005, Apple opened the Meadowhall store in Sheffield and the Trafford Centre store in Manchester, UK. Recent additions in the London area include the Brent Cross Apple Store, January 2006, the Apple Store in Westfields and Shepherd's Bush, September 2008, and the Apple Store in Covent Garden, August 2010, which is currently the largest store in the world. Also, in an effort to court a broader market, Apple opened several mini-stores in October 2004 in an attempt to capture markets where demand does not necessarily dictate a full-scale store. The first of these stores was opened at Stanford Shopping Center in Palo Alto, California. These stores follow in the footsteps of the successful Apple products, iPod mini and Mac mini. These stores are only 1/2 the square footage of the smallest normal store and thus can be placed in several smaller markets. Apple and iWeb services. In 2000, Apple introduced its iTools service, a set of free web-based tools that included an email account, internet greeting cards called iCards, a service called iReview that gave internet users a place to read and write reviews of websites, and a tool called KidSafe that promised to prevent children from browsing inappropriate portions of the web. The latter 2 services were eventually cancelled because of lack of success, while iCards and email became integrated into Apple's Mac subscription-based service introduced in 2002 and discontinued in mid-2008 to make way for the release of the new Mobileme service, coinciding with the iPhone 3G release. Mobileme, which carried the same $99 annual subscription price as its Mac predecessor, featured the addition of push services to instantly and automatically send emails, contacts and calendar updates directly to users' iPhone devices. Some controversy surrounded the release of Mobileme services to users, resulting in expected downtime and a significantly longer release window. As a result of this, Apple extended the subscriptions of existing Mobileme subscribers by an additional 30 days free of charge. 150. At the WWDC event in June 2011, Apple announced its most up-to-date cloud service, iCloud, replacing Mobileme. This service kept most of the core services that Mobileme offered, however dropping iDisk, Gallery, and iWeb. Additionally, it added a number of other features to the group, including Find My Mac, iTunes Match, Photo Stream, Documents, and Data Backup, and iCloud Backup for iOS devices. The service requires users to be running iOS 5 and OS X 10.7 Lion. iTunes Store. Main article, iTunes Store. The iTunes Music Store was launched in April 2003, with 2 million downloads in the first 16 days. Music was purchased through the iTunes application, which was initially Macintosh only. In October 2003, support for Windows was added. Initially, the Music Store was only available in the United States due to licensing restrictions. In June 2004, Apple opened its iTunes Music Store in the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. A version for the European Union version opened October 2004, but it was not initially available in the Republic of Ireland due to the intransigence of the Irish Recorded Music Association, IRMA, but was opened there a few months later on Thursday, January 6, 2005. A version for Canada opened in December 2004. On May 10, 2005, the iTunes Music Store was expanded to Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Switzerland. On December 16, 2004, Apple sold its 200 millionth song on the iTunes Music Store to Ryan Ailkman from Belchertown, Massachusetts. The download was the complete U2, by U2. Just under 3 months later, Apple sold its 300 millionth song on March 2, 2005. On July 17, 2005, the iTunes Music Store sold its 500 millionth song. At that point, songs were selling at an accelerating annualized rate of more than 500 million. On October 25, 2005, the iTunes Store went live in Australia, with songs selling for $1.69 each, albums at, generally, $16.99 and music videos and Pixar short films at $3.39. Briefly, people in New Zealand were able to buy music off the Australian store. However, that loophole was quickly closed. On February 23, 2006, the iTunes Music Store sold its 1 billionth song. The iTunes Music Store changed its name to iTunes Store on September 12, 2006, when it began offering video content, TV shows and movies, for sale. Since iTunes' inception, it has sold over 2 billion songs, 1.2 billion of which were sold in 2006. Since downloadable TV and movie content was added, 50 million TV episodes and 1.3 million movies have been downloaded. In early 2010, Apple celebrated the 10 billionth song downloaded from the iTunes Music Store. Intel Transition. Main article, Apple Intel Transition. In a keynote address on June 6, 2005, Steve Jobs officially announced that Apple would begin producing Intel-based Macintosh,